copper is in a cycle or a super cycle, you may call it.
We have this cycle which is basically led by AI, which is led by power transmission and distribution, which is happening because of electrification of vehicles. EV vehicles are coming.
Out of 1,000 kgs of copper ore, you could get around 15 kgs, 1.5% of good copper. But now it's fallen down to 0.6%.
Biggest economic winner as such is usually the miner. India has eventually become an importer of copper, whereas we should have an exporter.
Thank you so much, Amit sir, for doing this. We came across your profile on Twitter and we were very excited to see you engaging with our Twitter account and you following us. You've been one of the few saner folks in the industry who we also love to hear your thoughts about. And you've been running FinTrekk Capital for a while. उससे पहले भी आपका wealth में career है. And when this opportunity came to talk to you about copper, I was really excited. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to read all your posts at Zerodha. And happy to be here to interact on this topic. Hope we can bring out some details about this copper cycle.
The reason I think we chose copper was because whenever we did our research, right, whenever we picked up any topic, a lot of the news that we got was around the energy transition, and a lot of the news also came around AI. And copper was at the center of it. We've also covered copper in our daily brief articles as well at depth. So copper was a common theme that came throughout, which begged the question that, okay, copper is in a cycle or a super cycle, you may call it. But isse pehle bhi, we've seen copper go through the cycle. When I was going to do my research, it mentioned there were 4 times earlier. It was, I guess, the 2009-11 stimulus rally because of China that happened. And usse pehle bhi we've seen copper rallies come in, but all of them also had 50% drawdowns. So my read of the situation is ki not everything goes to the moon. Everything that goes up should come down. But is this time different? Or in a sense, is this truly a super cycle where the price trend is in a very structural bullish phase? Or is it again one of those things where things go up and things come down?
So I think you're right to be skeptical, how the rally unfolds. Eventually, commodity super cycles in the past also have gone boom and bust. That has been the pattern. But the reasons can differ a lot. So for example, you talked about the 2000s one. There have been rallies in the past also, but let's concentrate in the last 25 years because that's most recent and most panic has happened because of the structural drawdowns. So first, it happened in the China with the China industrialization from like 2000, early 2000s till about 2007-8. So that was a completely demand shock. Because China was going all in with the urbanization. There was a huge grid build out which was happening, and there was a property boom which was happening. So copper I think went from 3,000 to about 6,500 or so, almost doubled in that phase of about 5 years. And then the global financial crisis happened. So the intensity of that copper use sort of peaked out earlier. Also, a lot of supply came on board. So you had mines of copper mines in Chile or Peru, which came across. So that was one. Then it corrected, obviously, 50%. Then you had this QE boom in 2009 till about 2012-13, when US had QE1 to there was a QE super cycle. Again, that was a sort of a demand shock. That was a coordinated fiscal plus credit move by the central banks. But that was followed by a lot of capex also, which happened in the mining. Kafi mines वगैरह खुली थी. So there was a massive mining capex which followed. And again, there was a sort of a correction. A lot of that correction was that basically oversupply came. A lot of mines came up. So the supply response was quite persistent at that point of time. So you had another correction. Third was after COVID, when again you had, because of the COVID, everything was shut down and you had a very strong fiscal transfers which were happening. People were Companies were getting zero loans on 0%, and obviously after COVID lockdowns opened up, there was a demand spike. So when that demand spike happened, again, copper went up, but then there was a China property slowdown. One of the premier players in China, Grenade, they sort of collapsed. So there was a China property slowdown. There was a tightening liquidity because inflation went through the roof. So that sort of killed the marginal demand. And again, we saw a little bit of correction, 30% correction almost in copper. And then now we have this cycle which is basically led by AI, which is led by power transmission and distribution, which is happening because of electrification of vehicles. EV vehicles are coming. So in that sense, this cycle is still playing out. So the copper cycle is also playing out. How far it goes, it looks like, next 3 to 5 years, it should stay. When it's going to stop and whether we are going to have another 50% drawdown, that is very difficult to predict at this point of time, because right now the cycle is up. The copper prices are also up. So right now the tailwinds are there. When this signals get distorted, that we have to watch out in the next 2-3 years.
Fair enough. I think throughout, the thesis that you shared, there was always a time where you mentioned that supply eventually caught up. The supply responsiveness, all the price was enough for the prices to eventually mute down. Now let's just talk about supply only, right? When I was researching, I found that, the ore grades have fallen a lot. So there was this stat where I was reading that pehle ore grade was, let's say, 1.5%, which basically means out of 1,000 kgs of copper ore, you could get around 15 kgs, 1.5% of good copper. But now it's fallen down to 0.6%, because even eventually when you're mining ore, now I'm getting to the specifics of it, the easiest copper to mine is the one on the surface. And the further you go underground, the more difficult it gets to mine. And also the incremental copper you get out of it is also very less. I'm assuming this is a structural thing, and the capacity eventually catching up, I'm not sure that will happen, because again, I also read that copper mines usually take years to come online. And we've had our fair share of copper plants shutting down over past couple of years. 2018 Sterlite being one of the biggest cases, right? Do you think whatever happened, in the past 3 cycles where supply eventually caught up, it's going to happen this time soon? What's your take on that? Because from whatever little I read, I don't think supply would be responsive enough.
So supply will take time to catch up because, a lot of the mines are either very old, so they are already providing the iron ore, already providing the ores, or they are in the construction phase. Now, one needs to understand that copper mine overnight nahi banti hai. Copper mine can take anywhere between 5 to 15 years to basically start producing the output. And after that also, whether it is lower grade, higher grade, what is the environmental impact of that, that we need to understand. So, I mean, just to get to very, very, very basics, like what does a 1.5% grade means, or now what does that 0.5% grade mean? So that means simply कि 100 टन रॉक अगर हमने तोड़ा तो उसमें 1.5 टन का कॉपर निकला, या हाँ 100 टन रॉक तोड़ा तो अब हमारा 0.5 निकलता है. So these are grades of copper which comes out. So that means if you are mining 1.5% grade, you are getting more output out of it. But if you are doing a 0.5% grade, that means you are basically, for the same copper output, you are getting 3x more material. So you are crushing more rock, आपको energy ज़्यादा लग रहा है, you are processing more water, you have to manage more waste material, etc. So in that sense, a lot of these mining places which are coming, they are taking time to come back. India has just started in the last couple of years to actually start mining. There has been Adani's, JSW's, Hindalco's of the world which are doing it. But can it distort the copper market? I don't think it will happen very soon. But it also depends on, how the AI works. If AI really goes through a sort of a linear move in the next 3 years, 5 years, then it could be a case that we are short of copper. But till that, I think it should be okay. It should be okay in that sense. So because, adding new copper supply takes time. You have to discover low quality deposits. You have to process that materials. There has to be capital deployed. You have to survive all the political and the environmental risk. These days political risk are too high. I'm not talking about like local government or national government. Even geopolitical risk is too high. And then countries are actually using geopolitics to basically stop the supply of all the raw materials to their own country. So it's happening. So my sense is that copper sort of is currently oscillating between surplus and scarcity, but I don't think till AI is on a sort of a linear path, we are okay. But at some point of time, we could be shortage of copper.
There's one more thing that I read, that whenever there's a shortage of something, we also end up eventually finding substitutes of it. And I was reading how aluminium is another metal, although both of them have very different conductivity and very different properties. But do you see that angle coming in, which sort of naturally caps the demand growth for copper? Should the price of copper actually skyrocket? It reached 13,000, and now obviously it's relatively lower than the all-time high. But should the price continue to go up, do you see over the horizon that substitution also eventually becomes a natural price cap for copper?
See, it always happens. If you actually read the history of economics over the last 50 years, you'll always realize that history suggests that markets do eventually find workarounds when scarcity becomes very severe. It has happened with every major industrial material. When the oil shocks hit in the 1970s, when we had this Iraq war and all, economies became dramatically more energy efficient. When the fiber optic technology matured, and there's all the aluminum and the optical cables displaced, portions of traditional copper demand, because the demand for telecom was so high in the early 2000s, we changed. Similarly, when the platinum prices spiked in the early 2010s, a lot of automakers engineered lower loadings in the converters so that they don't have to use platinum. So, humans are smart in that sense. People in R&D are smart enough. So industrial systems adapt to the price pressures, because high prices are essentially information signals that tells everyone in the ecosystem that this has now become economically irrational and we need to find an alternative. So can we find alternatives of copper? Well, copper, is a very unique metal in the sense that it offers very exceptional combination of there is an electrical conductivity, thermal conductivity, and durability, and also recyclability. That's why it's used so much primarily in the electrification phase, or the power distribution and transmission phase which we are having. So there are substitutes. Aluminum is obviously one of them, which is the most obvious replacement candidate. It has already displaced copper in certain transmission lines and power applications because it's cheaper, it's lighter. But then it's also less conductive, so you cannot use it everywhere. In EVs and data centers, also somewhere we have started using aluminum. But whether there are other very efficient substitutes, the answer at this point of time is no. But never know. India. Scientists are smart enough to find another alternative if it goes out of hand. Price goes out of.
I think that gives a good macro picture to the copper story, and I want to actually get into the business end of things, and that primarily involves understanding the value chain. And my question to you is very simple, but I know the answer would be dense. When copper prices go from $6,000 to $13,000, throughout the value chain, the economics of value chain, who captures the most value? Is it the miner which is getting copper out of the ground? Is it the refiner who are working on those refining margins? Is it the end user industry who's maybe eventually able to pass on the price to the end consumer? In this whole value chain, again, as the copper moves through it, who makes more money should the prices go up and should the prices go down, and who gets squeezed the most? Maybe this way I'll be able to better understand how can I eventually play the copper theme as well, which is a separate question, but yeah, maybe let's start from here.
See, when the copper prices rises, the biggest economic winner as such is usually the miner, जो copper निकाल रहा है, the upstream miner, because they are the low cost producers. Because the most of the mining cost, labor, energy, sustaining capex they do not rise as fast as the copper price. So copper price will rise faster than other things. All these things will sort of are eventually a line item in the balance sheet. So the incremental price gains largely flow straight into the operating margins and the free cash flows of these companies. Miner producing copper at, let's say, $4,500 or $6,000 suddenly see enormous margin expansion when copper has doubled to 13,000 currently, or 14,000. Now, under that also, there are two parts to it. One is the refiner, one is the smelter. So their economics are also driven largely by the what we call as treatment and refining charges, TCRCs, which we call, rather than just outright copper prices. When there are tight supply, which often coincide with higher prices, these TCRCs usually fall. ठीक है ना, कॉपर प्राइस ज़्यादा जाएगा तो सप्लाई टाइट होगी तो ये फेल करेगी, TCRC की रेशियो फेल करेगी. That means smelters can actually get squeezed in a copper bull market because miners gain bargaining power. माइनर्स पे बार्गेनिंग पावर ज़्यादा होगी क्योंकि निकाल वही रहे, तो स्मेल्टर्स पे कम होती है, तो स्मेल्टर्स के मार्जिन्स थोड़े कंप्रेस हो सकते हैं. ये तो अपस्ट्रीम की बात हुई. डाउनस्ट्रीम एंड पे हम देखेंगे तो देर आर मल्टीपल वेज टू प्ले इट. देर आर वायर्स एंड केबल्स, you can have electrical equipments, you can have component manufacturers, but these are mostly pass-through businesses. Copper is treated in the whole their value chain. Copper is just a raw material input that gets passed to customers usually via fixed formula or inventory adjustments. So if the copper prices spike too quickly, then working capital requirements can increase very dramatically and very quickly. And margins can temporarily compress if the demand is not there. If the demand is there, then margins may not compress, but volume expansion will be there. So anyone with a good hedging system, strong hedging system, and a good working capital cycle, they will benefit. But they do not make money because the copper prices are rising, because they are passing it on. It's like, just to give an example of another industry, it's what happens with paints. When the crude prices spikes, Asian Paints, let's say, pass on those prices to pass on that price hike to the dealers. And similarly, if the crude prices goes down, they also passes on that price deduction to the dealers. Similarly, things happen here. In the downstream, wires and cables, electrical equipment, component manufacturers, the prices of copper gets passed on. So it's a complete pass-through. Now, how much is the demand? That will decide whether the margins get compressed or margins go up. So in most of the cases, if certain companies then play on the substitution parts, ki copper ki jagah can we provide aluminium, that those things can happen. But usually the real squeeze follows out on the manufacturers with fixed price contracts or companies which are holding very low cost inventory. So that's why you're seeing this change from unorganized to organized players or the listed players, you can say. Because the unorganized players, they cannot hold so much of inventory. They don't have the working capital capacity to hold that much of inventory because the prices have gone up. अभी $7,000 था कॉपर, अभी 13,000 हो गया, डबल हो गया, तो आपकी इन्वेंट्री आपको कम लेनी पड़ेगी अगर आपके पास वर्किंग कैपिटल ज़्यादा नहीं है. तो दैट्स व्हाई द डाउनस्ट्रीम पे जो ये लोग हैं, they are getting a little bit benefited because demand is very strong because of AI, because of electrification, etc.
So if I were to wrap it up again, the biggest beneficiaries will be mining companies because they have fixed costs, and the sudden spike actually improves their margin a lot, giving that operating leverage. And all of that benefits come there. The TCRC margins get compressed solely because the supply coming from these miners is very low, but eventually smelters are still the same. So the same set of smelters and refiners are fighting for that lower supply, eventually squeezing the margins. And I guess I read somewhere where few of these Chinese smelters were actually agreed to do smelting at $0 per ton in December at the peak of that spike. And the third downstream is where obviously we see the unorganized to organized shift also happening because they aren't able to take all this inventory. And mostly it's a timing of cash flow problem where eventually the pass on happens. But how well is a company able to do is a function of their hedging strategies. And is there even brand at play here? Because I'd like to believe a brand which has enough negotiation power over its distribution channel will be able to pass it on much effectively. And also, again, I read it somewhere, I guess it was the paint industry only, where when the crude prices go down, doesn't necessarily mean that the prices of paints will also go down. They might remain the same, hence expanding the gross margins a bit. Does that happen, or is that a right frame of thinking for even copper downstream industries?
Mostly it's the same line of thinking that copper prices are basically the pass through both in the up cycle and in the down cycle. But how much working capital you can squeeze out of it, that really depends on your brand. So an organized player with the proper taxing and accounting and the working capital limits will be able to do more business, more volumes in an up cycle than a unorganized players who is usually squeezed by the working capital constraints. You talked about the Chinese smelters doing on $0. That's an extraordinary signal because it effectively means that the copper concentrate market has completely flipped in the favor of miners. In normal conditions, what will happen? The smelters are paid TCRCs for converting that concentrate into refined coppers. So those are the fees are the economic foundation of a smelting industries. But when this benchmark TCRCs collapse towards zero, it means that the base of the concentrate has become so scarce that smelters are aggressively just to secure the feedstock. So even if it is processing, it generates a little or no margin. It is okay. And China has sort of mastered this activity of selling at no profit, no loss, or selling it slightly loss just to keep the factories running. So that's what we are seeing. We have seen in December also. So at the same time, in the downstream, what you are talking about is absolutely right. People with the brand and people with the larger working capital market, they are able to tap much better.
Again, talking a bit more about, before we get into the Indian players, talking about miners, where this is a point where they have all this leverage. I also read up, there was a possibility of a merger between Glencore and Tinto, which are one of the largest copper mines in the world. So I'm assuming there's some sort of consolidation happening on the miner end of things. So what's your take on that? Like, why is it happening in the first place? Even though it fell off, the deal didn't go through, but why is it happening? Aren't these mines standalone profitable enough to sustain their operations? Or is it part of the larger strategy where all these assets are coming together to have much higher negotiation power over other players in the value chain?
See, a lot of these mergers have been explored in the past, but they haven't happened. We had this, I think, Glencore and Rio Tinto. They started doing the merger discussion, but the valuations did not match. So a few years ago, I think also Rio Tinto and BHP, I think they were planning mergers, but they haven't gone through. A lot of this is because they are present in so many geographies. So, everything needs to come together from a legal point of view, from the politics point of view. The political systems need to be satisfied that, this copper going exporting, what we are exporting, that is in national interest, etc. So what we have seen is that somehow these deals have fell through. And, every copper mine, has sort of its own limitations of how much it can do without hurting the environment. So if it starts hurting the environment, then you have these legal cases which goes on. That happened a lot with Glencore. So in that sense, what we have seen is that the copper story is real, but it does not really fully trust miners to convert that macro story into sort of clean shareholder returns. So BHP has done repeated attempts to actually merge, but for somehow, whether it is valuations or whether it is governance disagreements, that logic hasn't so that does not mean they are not doing well. All their management teams very strongly believe that copper supply is valuable enough to justify their current presence. But when it comes to merging them, it has not worked. But on an individual basis, they're doing okay.
From a purely economic sense, tell me if I understand it correctly, it makes all the sense for them to capture most value. But the business of copper is such, and it's so dirty, especially when the whole world is moving towards ESG and all. It makes very little. It gets very difficult for them to actually sustainably end up doing so. Is my read on this apt? Environment governance, because again, this is a segue for me to even talk about the Sterlite plant, right? There was a time when it was supplying 90% of India's domestic demand. And after the environmental concerns, it got shut down. And no matter how strong the economic incentive is for us to restart as a country, because we are now a net importer of copper. Earlier, we were a net exporter of copper. Things still aren't turning the way. So is this, dirty side of copper mining so strong that no matter how much economic incentives exist, we are just not able to find a way out of it?
Worldwide, any industry which works, there has to be some sort of environmental impact. It is just impossible not to have that environmental impact. Whether that impact is within the limits or not, that is the question. If it's not within the limits, then the local authorities or the government has to take action to bring it within the limits, because it will impact the lives and the livelihoods of a lot of people which are staying it around. Now we can talk about what happened with Sterlite and all, but in general, most of the miners globally, I'm talking about, not specifically India, but globally, they have been subjected to very stringent environmental norms. And it's very difficult because the legal system is so strong. It becomes very difficult for them to break the laws very easily or get away with breaking the laws very easily. So they tend to fall on the right side of things. There will be always incidents when the industrialization is happening, but that's a byproduct of the environmental damage. The byproduct of industrialization. I think till with it's all in the limit, it's all good. But if it goes out of limit, then one has to take a concrete action. And then we can touch about if you want, we can go into detail about the Sterlite and all.
Before that, one trend that I've observed is, I don't know whether it's comparable, is that of steel. After CBAM got introduced on steel, eventually everyone started talking about green steel, and there's a premium attached to green steel, but it still is in the interest of the industry to move towards it, so that again steel consumption continues and steel production continues from at least India's end. Is there a future where, because eventually CBAM will also have copper come in by 2030, if I understand it correctly. Is there a future where, copper actually becomes a much greener version of it is today? And, all these bottlenecks that exist because of environmental concerns stop being a problem and supply actually becomes much more responsive and not contingent on the. Is that a possibility, or do you have any say on that?
No, see, CBAM phase 1 has already started in January, January 2026, 1st January. The copper isn't in it, but the EU has proposed extending CBAM to almost like 180 downstream products from 2028, including products of copper wires and cables. So the implications for Indian smelters, Indian downstream exporters, is quite significant, especially because the impact will not stop at smelters. It will extend to wires and cables. It will, extend to transformers, electric equipments. So all these, beneficiaries of expansion in electrification of vehicles or data centers or AI related themes, they will all get impacted because of CBAM. Now, how effectively they are able to do it, how effectively they are able to convert this carbon intensity into a trade cost. And once these products falls within the scope, will European buyers will buy them at a certain price and a certain quality? That we need to see over the next 2 to 4 years. But I know for the fact that a lot of the companies in the value chain they're already working towards having a green copper wire or green copper equipments being made. So I track a company called Usha Martin. They make these elevator ropes, and they are already working towards green copper initiatives and making their wire ropes green with green carbons, because they are a big exporter into the European countries. So it's not that it has come as a surprise. It was in the pipeline, and even the downstream exporters like Polycabs, KEI, Industries, RR Cables, they all needs to improve their carbon footprint of the copper inside their products, just for their efficiency, and then only they can push these products into the supply chain. So that will happen. It's a process over the next 4 years. Companies are already working towards it, and hopefully the whole picture will come through in the next few years.
Talking about just the Indian landscape now, you've already named a few downstream companies. Let's talk about the upstream companies. Wahan pe, what does the listed universe looks like? If I'm talking about having exposure to miners or through smelters and refiners, what does that look like from an Indian context?
So the largest player is obviously Hindustan Copper, which mines copper. But it being a PSU, it has already it's a most cleanest pure play copper beta stock, which I can talk. So, but it's also mostly cyclical and operationally constrained. Its revenues and valuations are obviously directly related to the copper mining and the concentrate economics. So when the copper rises meaningfully, like it has over the past few quarters, then the leverage to earnings can also be dramatic, and which has happened with. But the problem with Hindustan Copper is that it's a relatively small. Production growth is usually slow, and being a PSU, the operational execution is sometimes inconsistent. So it gives you the purest copper sensitivity, but not necessarily the highest quality business as such. I personally think that, even though this is not a forum, but I personally think that the market cap to valuation ratios is just out of the whack. So I would not like to play it through the cleanest pure copper beta kind of a play. The next is a little bit of a Vedanta. Vedanta, obviously, the Sterlite plan is down, but they are doing some copper mining from Zambia. They recently started last year one project in Saudi. So there you get some exposure of copper. Hindalco also is into mining now, even though it's not a direct copper proxy. It's mostly aluminium via Novelis, where they do the upstream aluminium operations. And then we have Adani Enterprises, who has a very big infrastructure conglomerate, which has also got into copper mining, and they can also do it over the next 3 to 5 years. And then you have the downstream ones, where Polycabs, KE, Finolex cables, RR cables, all these are sort of beneficiary of that.
So, how does an Indian retail investor play the copper theme the best way? Not pointing in any direction, is it domestically, internationally, through commodities, through futures? I don't know. What does a copper play portfolio, the satellite portfolio for copper theme look like for an Indian retail investor?
So I think it has to be a combination of a little bit of players, miners who are going to export in the future from India. So your Hindalcos and the Vedantas of the world, they will be exporting out of India. So these are one players. And the second is then in the downstream, you can have a look at all these cable and wire players, which benefit from the increase in the demand because of the electrification and because of the AI theme and all. So I think I'll have probably a combination. If I have to have 3 to 5 stocks, I'll have a combination of some of the metal players, and then the metal players who can export, and the metal players who are undergoing a copper mining, who have already started building capacities for copper mining. So you'll get proxy a little bit about other metals also there, aluminium, steel, etc. But basically you'll have copper also, and then in the downstream one can have 2-3 stocks from the cable and the wire place.
And one more thing that comes to my mind as I'm talking about betting on the copper theme is eventually the whole theme will be a function of the copper price. But what are a few leading indicators I should look at to understand the sense of where the copper market is headed? Is it, I don't know, the RCTC charges, or I don't know, is it the inventories that all of these companies hold? What are a few key metrics you look at to make sense of where the copper market is headed, so that even I can track that?
Uh, See, usually all of these can be used in conjugation. LME inventory sort of tells you where the market is currently. How much inventory they want to hold at a certain price. If there is a shortage, then LME inventory might have to decline if the price is really short up. Because you have to pay that much to hold that inventory. There is something called as Yangshan premium that tells you how aggressively China wants imported copper. So high rising premiums or high rising Yangshan premium, that usually implies that there is a very strong physical demand from China. And remember, China still utilizes about 65% of copper, and then they exports and use it domestically also. So high rising premium in Yangshan premium sort of indicate that there is very tight domestic availability. There is strategic stockpiling which is happening. Whereas the low or negative premiums often means they're weak import, the demand is not sufficient, etc. And then you have a look at all these miners where there is a supply issue. Like, for example, whenever a copper mine in Peru or in Chile, they get disrupted, and they get disrupted a lot because of environmental issues and because of unseasonal rains, etc. So whenever these environmental things happens, the supply gets impacted, and you always see a spike happening in copper margins. So I think Yangshan premium, this LME inventories, and disruption headlines across major mines. These three things I would look for, tracking the copper.
Amit, sorry for the dumb question, but when we say LME inventories, what exactly would that mean?
So LME is basically London Metal Exchange. It's the largest metal exchange in the world, and it basically tells you how much inventory a particular all the players are actually holding at one point of time, at any point of time. So this data is released every Thursday evening Indian time. That's a 1 week dated entry, but it tells you how much the week on week inventories have changed, whether they have gone up or whether they have gone down. So approximately in the last week how much the inventory has got exchanged, how much are the warrants sold or bought into that. It basically tells you how much easier is the availability or the financing happening, or how much is the demand is impacting. So it's basically a figure to track the inventories on a weekly basis.
Amit, if there are few things about the copper that the industry, the ecosystem that I failed to ask, but are important for somebody who's trying to make sense of the copper world, do you want to talk about that? If there's anything I missed.
Right. So I think it's an interesting time we are talking about it, because it's happening after like 4 or 5 days of Prime Minister talking about India being a copper importer then exporter. And we were an exporter of copper till about 2018 when the Sterlite plant sort of got shut down. So, I mean, without going into too much details about what happened, was that plant got shut down because of the workers' agitation. And then the Supreme Court also sort of put an order to it. Now, the interesting thing is that when it got shut down, even 4 or 5 years before that, I think it was in 2013, a national tribunal was actually, National Green Tribunal, NGT, was actually formed to evaluate this, whether there is an environmental damage from the Tuticorin plant into the nearby areas, and nothing came out of it. The same report was rejected, and in 2018 again this clash happened, and eventually the mine shut down in 2021. There were some unfortunate accidents, firing happened, few people got killed and all. But because of that, India has eventually become a importer of copper, whereas we should have an exporter. And that's the reason why, in the past 5 years, within the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme, India is now trying to have their own copper mining. So you are seeing Adani doing a copper mining in Kutch. Hindalco is also doing, even the JSWs and the Jindals of the world are also, getting into the copper mining, because this is a very essential commodity, and a very essential commodity within the value chain of where India is currently heading into. We need to have this energy transition. We need to be part of the AI boom. We need to have this electrification of vehicles, and for all that, we need copper. So I think, I hope that in the future this better sense prevails, and the courts take cognizance of Prime Minister's recent speech and the recent request. And if we can get a situation where the mine at Tuticorin actually gets open, the plant basically gets opened, it can provide a huge impetus to the Atmanirbhar Bharat. Because remember, it was not a very small plant. 20,000 people were working in it when it got shut down. And fine, if there are any environmental concerns, then they should be resolved, and the plant should be brought back to into a running condition. That's my hope, sincere hope, from what has happened in the last few days.
So one thing that Amit, this leads me to is trying to understand then how do you value an asset like that plant which sits on the balance sheet of Vedanta? Again, this is a company specific question, but regardless, how do you a certain value to it? Is there an optionality to it? Do we not consider this at all and consider it bonus? How do you value such things when they are subject to something outside the control of the company itself?
Yeah, so I have been tracking Vedanta for quite some time, and I don't see any analysts, actually assigning any value to the Tuticorin plant, because they have sort of resigned to the fact that this is going to keep shut down, and nothing will happen to it. Yeah, because it's not really dependent on the performance or the environmental issues. It's just the workers' agitation, union workers thing, which has happened, and you really don't know when Supreme Court is going to turn that decision. Already, I think twice, that decision has been put on hold, and no decision of opening the plant has come on. So you really don't know. I mean, in India, legal cases can go on for quite a long time, whether we like it or not. So currently there is no visibility that it happens, but the hope is there, sometime in the future, since country needs it now than ever before. Hopefully, something positive can come out, but as of today, there is no value assigned to it.
And if I understand it correctly, the Adani's Kutch plant is also soon to be operationalized. We'll eventually start seeing some output from there. And let's say there's a foreseeable future where, even this plant, Sterlite plant, goes live. What this means for the Indian economy would be, we'll be now importing more of copper concentrate, from these Latin American companies. But at the same time, hopefully this should reduce the cost of just copper downstream products for Indian companies, making it easier to, expand margins for these downstream players. Is that a good natural flow of logic as to what can eventually happen should this materialize? Or am I missing something else? Something more can happen.
None of these plants are going to be active in the next 3 years at least. I think Adani plans is going to come up in 2029 and fully by 2031. I mean, the full capacity utilization, which is going to happen. So currently the environment, prices could be high, but who knows, what will be the prices 3 to 5 years down the line when the full capacity comes on board. So I don't think the logic of whether it is Adani's or Vedantas or the JSWs and the Jindals of the world, they are not betting on the current TCRC's assumptions and TCRC's volumes, etc. They are making a longer duration strategic bet, that India would need an economy which is less dependent on oil, and which needs to be, a futuristic electrical economy with the grids and the renewables and the EVs and the cables, and it will be a manufacturing hub, and an infrastructure build out will be there. India's copper demand per capita, that is far below China's demand. China is at 9 ton. India is at some 0.5 ton. So there is a huge gap which needs to be bridged. and which means the domestic demand runway is also potentially very large for the next 20, 30 years for these players. So even if they take like 3 to 5 years to come on board, and it helps India to reduce dependence on these materials on China and other players, I think it's a bet worth taking, because India would need these miners to have copper within the country and utilize it, because we'll have sufficient demand in the next 20 years to when these mines come on demand. My mines come running in by 29, 30, whatever it is. So the Kutch project, I have been fortunate enough to have a little bit of seen a little bit with my own eye. So I think it's a very strategic, long duration, but a very strong infrastructure bet on India's electrifications. And I hope it sees the right path going forward.
Let's say, these things go eventually online. Let's say the timeline is 2030, not anytime sooner, but still we will be at the mercy of the miners, because I'm assuming we don't mine a lot of copper ourselves. I don't know how naturally gifted we are with the geographical gifts of having a lot of copper, but I'm assuming most of it does come from, Latin American countries. Is there a way around it, or that's just how it's always going to be, and we as India can only do so much?
So at this point of time, it looks a little difficult that how much we can actually smelt, and until unless the domestic demand really shoots up, then we have to find alternatives to actually mine here, smelt here, something which is China has done. If you know that Australia exports all its mining to China because the smelting is just not good enough, or there is no very strong Australian demand. Whatever they are mining, they have to export to China, so that China can then export to the elsewhere in the world. So I think that is not the case with India. India needs to have the mining, and there will be sufficient demand to have it. Now, whether we are going to have smelters enough to do it here, that we have to see. But we will not be completely independent of what's happening with the other economies. Somewhere we have to be dependent on the Latin Americas of the world. Because eventually, it's a issue of geographical location, essentially. We are not that lucky with the mining thing. So we will be dependent on a lot, but we can reduce that dependence. It's the same case with the oil. We cannot mine oil. That's like 2% of the oil which we are coming out with the new mines. But we will be dependent on Middle East to get the oil. Similarly, we will be dependent, but that dependency can reduce in going into the future after 2030.
So eventually, the best case scenario for India would be where our smelting and refinery capacity is such where the miners themselves would be incentivized to send it all to India to make it make sense for them as well. And that way we can have an upper hand, just like how China has it right now.
Yes, that's my sense. Yes.
I mean, Amit, it's been a lovely interaction. I learned a lot about copper. And thank you so much for being patient with my questions. Any last words before we say your goodbye?
It was a pleasure talking about this, and I hope your viewers and listeners find it useful. Always a pleasure to interact with you and the entire team at Zerodha. And thank you for having me. I hope I've learned a few things, talking about.
Thank you so much, Amit.
Yeah, thank you.